has to change. Either he needs to come to his senses and come back to the table in gratitude, or someone else needs to lead the country to do that. I mean, it's up to the Ukrainians to figure that out.
Well, that was House Speaker Mike Johnson saying it might now be time for Zelenskyy to step down. For more, let's bring in retired U.S. Army Brigadier General Mark Kimmitt. Also with us is former U.S. Ambassador to the Organization in Security and Cooperation in Europe and former Virginia Governor James Gilmore. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Lydia.
General, let's start off with you first. Your thoughts on what Speaker Johnson just said there. Should Zelenskyy step down?
Well, that's really up to the people of Ukraine whether he should step down. It's clear that he is under a lot of pressure from his own political party inside of Ukraine because of the mineral deal, which may have been an excuse for Zelenskyy or a reason for Zelenskyy to try to stand tough against President Trump. He was squashed like a sandwich between the Americans and his own parliament. And so, but I think at the end of the day, he made a wrong mistake in the way he handled the meeting. Should he step down? That's really up to the people of Ukraine.
But Ambassador, right now, Zelenskyy doesn't even want to have an election to be held. So where do we go from here?
Well, first of all, I think this. I think that President Zelenskyy needs some coaching. I think he should not come to the White House without wearing a suit. He is the president of a sovereign country, and he ought to look like one. I think that he ought to understand respectfully where he is in this communication, and should have been different, in my view. Now, I think he could use a little coaching about that, about how to handle himself in a diplomatic environment. I want to emphasize that it is in Putin's best interest for Zelenskyy to go. Zelenskyy has been the person who has led his country to security in terms of not being conquered overnight by Russia. And I think that the fundamental question we need to ask is it in the American interest or not for Russia to conquer Ukraine? That is the fundamental question I think we have after this press conference. I think Americans have to ask and answer that question. Is it in America's interest for Putin to conquer Ukraine? And if we conclude that it is, okay, then let it go, surrender. But if it's not, if it matters to the future of Eastern Europe and Western Europe and ultimately to the future of the United States, then I think we have to not give in to this idea that Zelenskyy somehow has to leave so that a surrender can occur.
General, a member of Trump's cabinet who also spoke during that meeting, he was also in the Oval Office, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, had this to say earlier today regarding a path forward. Take a look at this.
Everybody's saying security guarantees to secure the peace. You first have to have a peace. We don't even know if the peace is possible. And this was understood by the Ukrainians. It was explained to them repeatedly. And that is, here's our strategy. We're trying to get Putin to a negotiating table. Let's not everyone knows the history here, the back and forth. We understand that. We all understand that. But the question now is, can we get them to a table to negotiate?
And that's the key here, right? With Secretary of State Marco Rubio saying that we got to get to a point of negotiation. We want to bring peace. Obviously, the United States is not sending billions of dollars to Russia. They're sending it to Ukraine. We're talking $350 billion, according to President Trump. So even though he's saying we're not on anyone's side, clearly we are on the side of Ukraine. We don't see Putin sitting there in the Oval Office. What I think Trump is trying to say is he wants that peace through strength and use diplomacy instead of continuously just sending out money while more people continue to die. General, your thoughts. Is there a pathway to peace here?
Yeah, there certainly is, and I think Marco Rubio is exactly right. But what's really getting hung up in this entire conversation is this demand for security guarantees. Rubio's right. First, let's have the negotiation. First, let's bring a ceasefire. But there is remaining this large question about whether America wants to put its sons and daughters in Ukraine at a future date, fighting against Russians to guarantee the independence of Ukraine. That's a tough question. I don't think we've come to an answer. I think most Americans would say no. But that's a different question that's in front of us right now. The question in front of us right now is, how do we stop the fight? How do we start the negotiations? How do we start the rebuilding of Ukraine? In terms of what happens after the war, that's going to be a tougher question, but that doesn't need to be addressed now. stopping the fighting needs to be what's addressed now.
Ambassador, we have about a minute left. Senator Lindsey Graham, he's been a staunch supporter of Ukraine. He was also critical of Zelenskyy after what happened in the Oval Office. Here's what the senator said.
Be helpful. What I saw in the Oval Office was disrespectful, and I don't know if we can ever do business with Zelenskyy again. He either needs to resign and send somebody over that we can do business with, or he needs to change.
So you just heard Senator Lindsey Graham there kind of echoing what Speaker Johnson saying. Zelenskyy, it seems like he is changing his posture. He says he's willing to sign a minerals deal. Right now, as we speak, he's in the UK talking about a plan with Europe to present for a ceasefire deal. You know, there is that report that came out that said he was pressured by top Democrats, which has been disputed, but that he was told to be tough with Trump. Do you think maybe somebody put Zelenskyy up to this? He got some bad advice, and now he realized his mistake?
Yeah, maybe so. I think that going into the Oval Office to talk to President Trump is always a chancy thing, and he ought to be very carefully advised as to how to handle it. And I don't think that he was. But look, the negotiation for its own sake should not be the objective. The objective is what comes out of the negotiations. The question of whether President Putin is going to go to the negotiating table, he'll be happy to go to the negotiating table if Ukraine is simply delivered up to him in the negotiation. So negotiation alone, even a ceasefire, is not alone the objective that ought to be achieved. We have to ask the bigger strategic questions. What is in the American national interest here? What is safe for the safety and security of the American people? And you know, to the general's point, there is no discussion of Americans going into Ukraine to defend against Russia. But there very well may be British and French and German troops and European troops who may go in to supply that guarantee. I think President Zelenskyy is trying to get all that out on the table at the beginning. But I would have counseled Zelenskyy to have handled that meeting in a different way. And by the way, he ought to get a suit.
Yeah, maybe it is time for him to get a suit. All right. Retired Army Brigadier General Mark Kimmitt and Ambassador James Gilmore, what a pleasure to have you both. Thank you so much, sirs.
Thank you, Leah.
Information. Truth is freedom. Is Newsmax. It's real news for real people.